Some forests keep secrets. The Appalachians bury them alive. In these true horror stories from deep woods, you'll hear the last words of hikers who never escaped, and maybe you'll recognize a voice you wish you hadn't. Tonight, Dread Scribe writes, "Again, before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe for more chilling stories. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing where everyone is tuning in from, and if there's a story you'd like me to cover next, I'd love to hear it too." The forest swallowed me whole the moment I stepped off the main trail. The canopy stretched so high it seemed to stitch the sky shut, casting everything beneath it into a dim green twilight. My boots crunched against the damp soil, each step sinking slightly into a bed of old leaves. I had hiked alone plenty of times before, but there was something different about this part of the Appalachians. The air felt thicker, as though the forest itself were holding its breath, waiting for me to make a mistake. It wasn't fear that drove me forward. It was curiosity. That stubborn need to see what lay beyond the bends no one else seemed willing to explore. About an hour in, I noticed the first marking. It was carved deep into the trunk of an old sycamore, so weathered it seemed almost fossilized. The pattern wasn't random. It spiraled inward, lines interlocking like a puzzle I couldn't solve. My fingers traced its grooves, and for a fleeting second, I swore the bark pulsed beneath my touch, like a slow heartbeat buried deep within the tree. I told myself it was nothing more than imagination playing tricks on me, the way a mind does when isolated in the wild. But a mile later, another carving appeared, and then another. Each one different but unmistakably connected, like pages torn from a forgotten book scattered through the woods. The sun began to dip, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for me like skeletal fingers. Twilight in the forest isn't gradual. It's sudden, like a candle snuffed out. The birdsong faded, replaced by the eerie chorus of unseen creatures awakening in the undergrowth. That's when the forest began to speak, not with words, but with the subtle language of sound. A twig snapping far behind me, a rustle to my left, the hollow, rhythmic creak of trees swaying when there was no wind. Each noise seemed intentional, as if orchestrated to lure me deeper into its heart. My pace quickened, driven by a cocktail of wonder and unease. The carvings became more frequent now, etched into nearly every tree I passed. In the fading light, they seemed to glow faintly, catching the last remnants of daylight like ancient runes. My rational mind fought for control, whispering explanations. Maybe local artists, maybe old settlers marking territory. But a deeper, older part of me, the part that still remembered firelight and primal fear, knew better. These weren't decorations. They were warnings. By the time night fully claimed the forest, I was hopelessly disoriented. My map was useless, the trail long since swallowed by thick undergrowth. The moonlight filtered through the canopy in thin, ghostly shafts, illuminating patches of mist that clung stubbornly to the ground. Every breath I took came out in visible puffs, though the air wasn't cold. It felt as though I'd stepped into a different realm, one where logic no longer applied. And then, through the darkness, I saw it. A soft, warm glow cutting through the mist like a beacon. My heart surged with relief. Civilization. Safety. I stumbled toward it, branches clawing at my arms, until I burst into a small clearing. There, in the center, stood a single abandoned campsite. A lantern flickered on a log, casting long, trembling shadows. But the camp was empty. No tent, no gear, no footprints. Just the light. And then, from somewhere deep in the darkness beyond the clearing, I heard it, a whisper, low and intimate, curling around my name. The whisper slid through the trees like smoke, curling around my ears before vanishing into the hush of the clearing. My heart hammered so hard it felt like the sound belonged to the forest itself, echoing back at me from the trunks. I turned slowly, scanning the perimeter of the clearing, every shadow now shaped like a crouching figure. The lantern's glow trembled as if it sensed my fear, its flame stretching and shrinking, casting sharp angles across the empty space. The absence of footprints felt louder than any scream. Whoever had been here had left without a trace. Or maybe they had never been human at all. I crouched near the lantern, its heat a fragile comfort against the cool, damp air. The smell of kerosene mingled with moss and pine, a scent that should have been grounding but instead smelled like memory. like an old attic or a forgotten photograph. The carvings I had seen earlier etched themselves into my mind's eye, spirals and hooks, lines curling like vines, and I realized the trees surrounding the clearing bore even more of them. Some were high above my head, cut into the bark of impossibly tall oaks. Someone or something had marked this place as important. My fingers brushed the handle of the lantern. The metal was warm, almost too warm, like a living pulse. A sound cracked behind me, a branch snapping clean. I spun, my flashlight beam jerking across the trees, but it only illuminated fog. The mist caught the light and fractured it, scattering it like glass shards across the trunks. Each shimmer looked like eyes blinking open. I forced myself to breathe. Inhale, exhale. I thought of the scientific papers I'd read about infrasound in forests. Low frequencies causing feelings of dread. The way a predator might unnerve its prey without being seen. It was a comforting hypothesis, but deep down I knew it didn't explain the whisper that had pronounced my name perfectly. I backed toward the center of the clearing, the lantern's glow circling me like a thin shield. The carvings on the trees seemed to vibrate now, their edges shimmering faintly, as if reflecting a hidden light. My skin prickled. The air grew denser, and the mist rose, coiling around my ankles. The forest no longer felt like a collection of trees. It felt like a single organism, and I was inside its lungs. Every sound, every shift of wind was deliberate, like a heartbeat surrounding me. Then came another whisper. Closer this time, almost brushing my ear, a breath colder than the night air. My name again, but softer, coaxing rather than calling. It was the voice of someone who already knew me, though I couldn't place who. My chest tightened as a flicker of movement appeared between two trees, a shape not quite human, standing impossibly still. My flashlight caught only its outline before it slipped behind the trunk like a ripple of shadow. I reached for the lantern instinctively, but as my fingers closed around it, the flame dimmed to a fragile ember. The carvings on the trees seemed to draw inward, their spirals tightening like an eye shutting. The mist rose higher, swallowing my knees, my waist. In that moment, the clearing felt like a trap slowly closing, a mouth ready to swallow. My rational mind begged me to run, but my body stayed rooted, as if the soil itself clutched my boots. And then, from all around me, dozens of whispers rose at once, overlapping like a dark choir. My name dissolved into 100 voices, some high, some low, all speaking in a language older than words. The lantern flickered violently, casting monstrous shapes across the trees, and I realized with a jolt that every shadow in the clearing had turned toward me. Something was stepping out of the mist, and as its outline sharpened, I understood it hadn't been following me. It had been waiting. Black Hollow Ridge wasn't marked on most maps. It sat like a forgotten scar at the edge of the Appalachian Trail, a place hikers either didn't know about or deliberately avoided. When Ranger Collins first told me about the missing hiker, there was something in his voice that unsettled me. It wasn't just concern. It was resignation, like a man reciting a tragedy he'd witnessed too many times before. The young man's name was Ethan Ward, 23 years old, last seen 3 days ago heading toward the ridge with nothing but a small pack and a camera. Collins's eyes shifted nervously as he explained that hikers vanish here every few years, always near the same stretch of trail. The forest seemed to grow denser as we ascended, the sunlight thinning until it filtered through the branches in weak, pale beams. The air smelled of wet leaves and something faintly metallic like rust. I followed Collins closely, my boots crunching against layers of pine needles and old earth. At first it felt like any other hike. The quiet, the smell of cedar, the occasional bird call. But as we approached the ridge, the forest changed. The trees grew unnaturally uniform, each trunk standing perfectly straight, their branches tangled together like a woven net. It felt less like a forest and more like a barrier. Collins kept his voice low, almost a whisper. He told me Ethan had been an experienced hiker, confident and well-prepared. "He didn't just get lost," Collins muttered, glancing over his shoulder. "People don't just disappear out here." There was an unspoken weight to his words. I tried to push down the unease rising in my chest by focusing on the search. We found small signs at first. A water bottle wedged beneath a root, a scuffed patch of dirt that might have been a footprint. Ordinary clues, comforting in their mundanity. Then the corner of my eye, like sunlight glinting off water. I turned, and for a heartbeat, the forest wasn't empty. A figure stood between the trees, a young man with a red jacket, head tilted upward as if listening to something far away. My breath caught, and then he was gone, the space he'd occupied swallowed by mist. I didn't tell Collins. I couldn't. My logical mind clung desperately to explanations, stress, fatigue, the tricks isolation plays on perception. But deep down, I knew it was something else. As we climbed higher, the flashes grew stronger. My boots crunched on the trail, and suddenly I was seeing through someone else's eyes, Ethan's. He was running, branches tearing at his clothes, his breath ragged. The world tilted around him, disorienting and wrong. I stumbled, my knees hitting the dirt, and the vision dissolved. Collins grabbed my arm, his grip firm, his face pale. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't need to. The ridge loomed ahead, a jagged spine of rock cutting into the sky. The silence here was absolute, heavy like a held breath. And then I saw it, a backpack perched neatly atop a tree branch 20 feet above the ground, swaying gently in the breeze. My stomach dropped as Collins's voice trembled beside me. "This isn't the first time," he whispered. The words felt like a verdict, and the forest seemed to lean closer, listening. We stared at the backpack as it swayed above us. Collins didn't move. Neither did I. Forest sounds clicked like a slow clock. No ladder, no claw marks, no snapped limbs below. The motion didn't match the breeze. I grabbed at tidy reasons, prank, storm toss, hunter's hoist, but Black Hollow Ridge charges interest on reason. I stepped closer and the world slipped sideways. Not spinning, just slightly wrong. A picture frame out of square. Air pressed in without cooling. I raised my hand. The needles trembled as though space were a pond and my gesture a pebble. Collins hissed for me to stop. His pupils were too wide. Whatever he'd seen before hadn't let go. The vision unfolded. I was inside Ethan's body, red jacket heavy, grit rasping my teeth. A held tone threaded the air, the rim of a glass. Paths mirrored, stones doubled, the ridge repeating like a corridor in a dream. Ethan looked up. The branch seemed lower, or he stood higher. Distance refused to behave. He set the pack on the limb because the ground no longer felt trustworthy, as if gravity had joined the search. I came back with my palm on bark incised in lattices. 2 rotated grids, maps trying to share one page. Interference patterns flickered, waves crossing peaks where none should exist. People forget the math. Noise becomes guidance, guidance becomes trap. Collins says the ridge takes people. I wondered if it simply arranges them. A faint click drifted through the trees. Ethan's camera. It came from upslope, then downslope, then uncomfortably near. The same sound braided through 3 places at once. The backpack listed, then stilled. I said his name before I could stop myself, and something answered, not voice but a downward draw, as if the ridge inhaled. The metallic smell sharpened. Collins tied a rope from his waist to mine. Practice, new nightmare, and we advanced. My heartbeat counted our steps. 5, 8, 10. At 12, the pressure lifted. The wood snapped into ordinary relief. Then the rope sagged, though he still stood beside me. I turned. His outline wavered like heat above asphalt. His mouth formed my name, but the sound arrived late, syllables out of order. Between the latticed trunks, a figure resolved, humanoid, patient, as still as a blueprint pinned to a wall. It felt like place wearing a face. The camera clicked again from inside the backpack. I reached up. Distance shortened in a breath. Cold zipper teeth scraped my knuckles. I expected a wallet or map. Instead, I unfolded a photograph. Collins and I stood beneath this tree, the pack above. A third figure hovered between us, overexposed, as though light had decided to take sides. Wind shifted. Paper warmed like skin. The third figure brightened until its outline bled into the carved grids. To my right, a rock tumbled without landing. To my left, a footstep arrived without sound. The rope at my waist tightened, a tug from something unseen. The ridge drew a longer breath. We edged back with the pack, resisting the urge to look back. The photograph grew heavier, as though ink were still drying. Tilted to the light, it showed a new detail. Ethan's red jacket now stood where our footprints hadn't reached. In the silvered corner, a line appeared I hadn't written. Leave it where you found it, or else it remembers you. The fog rolled in like a slow tide, swallowing the trees one by one, until the forest felt like a cathedral of ghosts. My headlamp caught only fragments, Patches of moss, glistening spider silk, the slick sheen of rain clinging to bark. Each breath tasted of damp iron and cedar smoke, though there was no fire anywhere near me. I had wandered from the main path, chasing the sound of a bell I couldn't quite locate, a faint chime that drifted through the mist like a memory. My watch said midnight, but time in the woods has a way of bending, stretching like soft glass. I first saw him standing beneath a crooked birch, his figure blurred at the edges as though the fog preferred to keep him secret. He was tall but stooped, his coat an indistinct gray that blended into the trunks behind him. When he turned, my stomach lurched. His eyes were hollow, milky white pools without iris or pupil, reflecting no light at all. They reminded me of old river stones smoothed by decades of water, silent, opaque, unreadable. My rational mind scrambled for explanations, cataracts, an optical illusion, a trick of the mist, but nothing held. He spoke softly, his voice like wind moving through dry reeds. Words formed but carried double meanings, as if two languages overlapped. Guardians of the forest, keys of bone, doors of bark. Each phrase landed like a pebble in a deep well, vanishing before I could catch its echo. My pulse hammered in my wrists. I opened my mouth to ask who he was, but the question felt too small, too human. He lifted a hand instead, palm pale as moonlight, and pointed somewhere behind me. I turned instinctively, no more than a heartbeat, but when I looked back, he was gone. The fog swallowed the space where he'd stood, leaving only a hollow impression on the moss. My flashlight beam trembled as I swept it across the birch. At its base lay something small and metallic, catching the weak light. I crouched and picked it up. A pendant, heavy for its size, shaped like a crescent moon with etched lines curling inward like a tide map. The metal felt warm against my skin, as though it had been pressed into my palm by living fingers. I slipped it into my pocket, trying to slow my breathing. The forest had grown utterly still. Even the insects had fallen silent, their chorus replaced by a low hum I felt more than heard. My fingers closed over the pendant, and for an instant a rush of images slammed into me, branches arching like ribs, a dark shape gliding between the trees, eyes glimmering faintly in the mist. It was gone as quickly as it came, leaving me trembling. The pendant pulsed once, faint as a heartbeat, and the fog shifted around me. Somewhere deeper in the woods, something moved with a deliberate waiting patience. And though I stood alone, the sensation of being watched rooted itself behind my ribs, as real as the weight of the crescent moon in my hand. Back in the cabin, the pendant lay on my desk like a sliver of captured moonlight. Its surface caught the lamp's glow and twisted it into soft arcs, etchings curling inward like tidal currents frozen mid-surge. I'd spent the night trawling through brittle local archives and obscure folklore blogs, each page offering fragments without center. All of them circled the same motif: a guardian, a gatekeeper, something that wears a man's shape until it doesn't. The old wood of the cabin walls creaked in slow intervals, like a sleeper shifting in a dream. My fingers hovered over the pendant but didn't touch. The deeper I read, the more a pattern emerged. One article described a 19th century logger who vanished after reporting a hollow-eyed stranger, warning him to stop cutting spruce near the ridge. Another recounted a hiker in 1964 who received a crescent charm from a silent figure just before going missing. Each story was like a footprint at low tide, briefly visible before water erased it. I found myself cross-referencing maps of the forest, layering red pins where each disappearance had occurred. They formed a rough circle with Black Hollow Ridge at its heart, a geometry of warning hidden in plain sight. I tried to reason it out scientifically: pareidolia, folklore's inertia, coincidence feeding confirmation bias, but reason felt flimsy against the weight of the pendant. Its grooves matched diagrams of lunar nodes used in old navigation systems, but also mirrored the vascular structure of a leaf. It was a language of overlaps, nature's code repeating itself in bone and sky. My pulse sank to its shape. When I finally reached out, the metal felt cooler now, like riverstone. I closed my hand around it, and the room dimmed slightly as though clouds had passed over the sun. Then came the vision, sharper than before. I stood in the woods again, fog clinging to my skin like wet cloth. The hollow-eyed man moved between trees, his gait gliding, his coat trailing like a torn sail. He was closer this time, I couldn't see his mouth, but I felt words pour into me. Not sound, but intention, a reminder of boundaries. Guardians of the forest, keys of bone, doors of bark. The images unfolded, roots entwined like veins, a hidden door carved into living wood, a shape pressing outward as though ready to emerge. The pendant burned cold against my palm, a contrast that made me shudder. Outside, the night had gone silent again. No wind, no insects, just a hush heavy enough to bend the air. I stepped to the window. Between the skeletal silhouettes of trees stood a figure half veiled by mist. Even from that distance, I recognized the hollowness of its eyes. They were fixed on me, patient, unblinking. The pendant in my hand pulsed once more, like a small heart answering a larger one. And as the fog began creeping closer to the cabin's door, I realized the old man hadn't disappeared at all. He'd simply crossed the threshold where I couldn't follow until now. The entrance to the cave yawned like a dark mouth at the base of the limestone bluff, its edges dripping with water that caught the late afternoon sun like strands of melted glass. I hesitated on the threshold, boots sinking slightly into the damp earth, my breath fogging in air that smelled of minerals and something older, like wet stone and rusted metal left too long in rain. With a final glance at the forest behind me, I ducked inside, my flashlight beam carving a narrow corridor through the blackness. The light's halo trembled against the jagged walls as though the rock itself resisted being seen. The first chamber opened up like a cathedral carved by invisible hands. Stalactites hung overhead, glistening like the teeth of some patient creature, while pools of water lay perfectly still below, reflecting back a warped version of my face. Each step produced an echo that chased itself into the tunnels, returning a second later softer, stranger, like a mimic trying to learn my rhythm. My fingers brushed the walls and the stone felt slick and cool, almost alive. A skin stretched over something breathing just beneath. At first, the voices were faint enough to mistake for wind. A murmur rose from deeper in the cave, distant and blurred, vowels stretched like taffy. I paused, heart lifting in relief. Other hikers, I thought. Safety. Company. But the sound didn't move closer or recede. It hung in the air like a suspended thread, repeating in irregular bursts. I called out, my voice cracking, and the echo came back fractured, my words rearranged into something I didn't recognize. I pressed on, ducking through a low passage where the ceiling narrowed to a crawl space. The smell intensified, earthy and metallic, like an old coin pressed to my tongue. My flashlight flickered once, twice, then steadied, though its glow seemed weaker now, swallowed by the dark as though the cave drank light as well as sound. The murmur grew clearer. A man's voice begging, a woman gasping, a child's high-pitched plea, all broken, stuttering like a damaged recording. My chest tightened. These weren't random echoes. They were last words trapped in stone. A drop of water hit my shoulder and rolled down my back, cold as ice. I tried to ground myself in logic, acoustic phenomena, the way limestone channels sound, maybe even old recordings left by explorers. But every explanation dissolved as quickly as it formed, eroded by the raw human emotion pulsing from those voices. They weren't just sounds. They were memories, woven into the cavern like veins of ore. The tunnel widened again, revealing a hollow chamber draped in shadows. My flashlight trembled in my hand as the murmurs cut off all at once, leaving a silence so thick it pressed against my eardrums. I swallowed hard, my pulse roaring louder than the cave itself. Then, from directly beside my ear, a single whisper came, perfectly clear, soft as breath, speaking my name. My knees nearly buckled as the beam of my light swung wildly across the chamber, landing on nothing but empty stone. The sound of my name still trembled in the air like the last note of a struck bell. I pressed my back to the damp wall, the stone slick under my palms, grounding me, and yet feeling strangely warm, as if something pulsed within it. My flashlight sputtered once more and then steadied, casting a weak circle of light that barely reached the far edges of the chamber. The darkness beyond it was no longer a backdrop. It had weight, depth, and a slow, deliberate patience, like water waiting to close over a diver's head. I forced myself forward, one step at a time, boots scraping across uneven rock. The chamber's ceiling rose into an arch lost in shadow, and stalactites dripped with steady rhythm, a clock I couldn't read. My breathing echoed back at me, but softer, then softer still, until I wasn't sure which breaths were mine, and which belonged to something else. The air was damp but also electric, tiny prickles skating across my arms. It felt like standing beneath storm clouds, waiting for a strike. Then the voices returned, not distant this time but surrounding me, layering over one another in a low, mournful chorus. Words surfaced briefly before dissolving, fragments of prayers, apologies, final warnings. I caught my own voice among them, or something wearing it, whispering syllables I hadn't spoken yet. Each utterance clung to the walls like frost, imprinting itself in the rock. My rational mind strained for an anchor, seismic vibrations, the resonance of dripping water. But every theory snapped under the weight of hearing my own future voice. The tunnel narrowed to a jagged throat. I crouched and moved through, my flashlight grazing the walls. Carvings appeared there, faint and shallow at first, then deeper. Names, dates, phrases etched by shaking hands. Some marks were fresh enough to flake under my touch. I recognized one immediately, Ethan Ward, the missing hiker from Black Hollow Ridge. My pulse spiked. I'd never been here before, yet this place already knew the paths I'd walked. The murmurs swelled, voices overlapping until they blurred into a single drawn-out moan. My name rose again from the din, closer, pressed against my ear, though nothing stood beside me. I bolted, instinct taking command, flashlight beam jittering across slick stone. The passage twisted without pattern, doubling back on itself, but somehow my feet found a slope leading upward. My lungs burned as cold air sharpened, promising the surface. I burst from the cave mouth into twilight. The forest outside looked unchanged, trees still, mist low, but my knees trembled as if I'd crossed a threshold into somewhere thinner, less stable. My flashlight dangled from my wrist, its beam shaking over the ground. That's when I saw them, a set of fresh footprints leading back into the cave. The treads were identical to mine, down to the small tear in the heel. They weren't fading with rain or wind. They were waiting, and the whisper that spoke my name inside the cavern had not stopped. It had simply stepped outside with me. The town of Coldwater Hollow clung to the mountainside like a secret, its narrow streets winding between weathered cabins and pine-covered ridges. I'd heard of its annual lantern festival for years, a night when the entire valley glowed like a river of stars, but nothing prepared me for the moment I stepped into the main square. Hundreds of lanterns swayed above me, their warm gold light shimmering through the fog. The air smelled of pine smoke and mulled cider, mingled with something metallic and strange, like iron left too long in rain. Locals filled the square in hushed excitement, their faces half lit by the soft glow. Most lanterns burned a gentle amber, but here and there, a few pulsed with an unnatural crimson light, deep and liquid like fresh blood. I felt an instinctive chill when I saw the first one, its red glow cutting through the mist like a wound. A woman beside me noticed my stare and shook her head sharply. "Don't follow those," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the low drone of a mountain fiddle. "The ones who carry them are marked." I wanted to ask what she meant, but her eyes shifted nervously toward the tree line, and she vanished into the crowd before I could speak. The word lingered, marked. As the night deepened, the festival grew stranger. Drums began to beat in a slow, hypnotic rhythm, matching the thud of my pulse. Children twirled with laughter near the fountain, while older townsfolk huddled in tight circles, whispering in tones that never quite reached my ears. Every so often, a figure carrying a crimson lantern would slip silently between the revelers, heading toward the dark edge of the forest. No one stopped them. In fact, people seemed to look away deliberately, as if pretending not to see. My curiosity gnawed at me like a splinter. When a tall man with a red lantern passed near me, I caught a glimpse of his face, blank, expressionless, his eyes reflecting only the crimson light. He moved as if in a trance, steps slow and deliberate. Without thinking, I followed. We left the square behind, the festival's warm sounds fading into a cold, oppressive silence. The forest swallowed us quickly, the mist thickening until the lantern's glow became my only guide. Branches arched overhead like ribs, enclosing us in a tunnel of shadow. I stayed far enough back to avoid being seen, though the man never once turned his head. Eventually, we reached a clearing I hadn't known existed. Dozens of crimson lanterns hung from low branches, their light pooling on the forest floor in unnatural patterns. Figures knelt beneath them, chanting words I didn't understand. At the center stood a stone altar draped in moss and offerings, bones, feathers, and objects that looked disturbingly human. The air vibrated with an ancient, unearthly hum. As I crouched behind a tree, my breath shallow, the chanting stopped. Slowly, every figure turned toward the darkness beyond the clearing, as though waiting for something to emerge. And from somewhere deep in the tree line wasn't a single body so much as the night rearranging itself. The tree line thickened and thinned, needles shivering in wind I couldn't feel. A low resonance rolled through the clearing, sound you register in bone before ear, pressing the moss like a palm on still water. The kneeling figures lifted their lanterns together. Crimson soaked the fog like dye and cloth, and I felt the urge to step back, but the ground cupped heels. A woman rose with a burlap bundle and extended it. I never saw what rested inside, yet a metallic sweetness threaded the air, like a penny on the tongue. The hum climbed a half-tone. The man I'd followed raised his lantern higher, and in that circle I glimpsed antlers, then the outline of a human forearm, then nothing, as if the forest edited itself between frames. But what the town didn't expect was the answer that came from behind me. A whisper slid along my ear, glassy and precise, speaking my name as if already owned. The nearest lanterns dipped as though acknowledging a late arrival. For a beat I wondered if I had been marked, some invisible ribbon tied at the throat. I gripped a root for balance. Warmth pulsed through the bark like a sleeper turning over. A child stepped from the circle carrying a crimson lantern. They approached the trees, small and steady. Something leaned out to meet the flame. The red lens painted hollows where a face should be. My chest tightened. I thought of infrasound and startle reflexes, of deer freezing at frequencies we barely register. We call it instinct. The forest might call it etiquette. Dawn smudged the ridge like charcoal, and the ritual unwound. Lanterns guttered toward amber. People rose thin as sleepwalkers. The clearing emptied in twos and threes, leaving seams of silence where bodies had been. No one spoke the missing. They counted the subtraction with their eyes. The tall man did not return. Neither did the child. I followed the path toward town, heart stumbling, breath loud as boot crunch on frost. At the square's edge, a volunteer pressed a lantern into my hands without meeting my gaze. Its glass looked ordinary, amber as tea, but as daylight bled over the roofs, the flame slid toward a deeper shade, as though remembering night. A wire of red braided through the wick, brightening like an ember answering breath. By late morning, ribbons fluttered from eaves and storefronts opened as if nothing had unstitched the valley. I turned the lantern to shade, then to sun. The color pooled anyway, settling into impossible crimson. The metal warmed against my palm. Somewhere in the pines, a low tone rolled and fell, like thunder thinking better of itself. I caught my reflection in the curved glass, eyes ringed in gray, pupils wide. No one looked at me, not the grocer sweeping his steps, not the children chalking stars. People parted as if I carried weather. The flame ticked brighter with each step toward the last fence post at the forest's edge. I told myself I could set it down and walk away. I told myself I could still choose. The wick flared, the glass breathed red, and a familiar whisper braided through the smoke, patient, certain of my next step. The first night on the ridge had been beautiful in a quiet, hollow way. My tent sat on a narrow patch of moss between two leaning firs, the stars scattered above like spilled salt. The fire's last embers winked out, leaving only the muted hum of insects and the smell of pine sap seeping from broken branches. I drifted into half-sleep, listening to the forest settle, until the footsteps began. They were heavy but measured, circling my tent just beyond the thin fabric. Each step pressed a low vibration through the soil into my ribs. I held my breath and listened, straining to catch a pattern. Predator, prankster, wind. But the steps didn't match any rhythm of animal or man. They paused, then scraped, then shifted, as though something were trying on different gates, learning. A branch snapped. I clenched my fists inside my sleeping bag, heart hammering against the nylon like a trapped bird. I forced myself to speak, a simple test, a trembling greeting. But the sound died before it reached the trees. The footsteps stilled. Silence swelled thick and absolute, erasing the crickets, even the breeze. Then, faint but deliberate, came a low murmur echoing my own voice. Syllables cracked and scattered like glass. It repeated my greeting back to me, almost perfect, except for the breath between words. A beat too long, like a student struggling with a new language. The darkness pressed closer. I stared at the thin curve of my tent door, waiting for a shadow to break the fabric of night. But nothing came. The steps withdrew, fading uphill into the trees, until all that remained was the trembling of my hands and the damp taste of fear on my tongue. I lay awake until dawn, the sky paling slowly as though reluctant to intervene. Morning light made everything absurdly ordinary. The forest glistened with dew, birds flickered between branches, and a single track of boot prints circled my camp before veering off into undergrowth. I convinced myself it had been a late hiker, a local cutting through the trail. Fear dissolves quickly in daylight, like frost retreating from a window pane. I packed my gear slowly, savoring the warmth of coffee from my tin mug. That's when he appeared, a man in a faded blue jacket, hiking poles strapped to his pack, a smile easy and practiced. He greeted me with a casual wave, his voice steady, friendly, everything my fear from the night before had not been. We chatted about trails, weather, the usual mountain small talk. Then, without breaking stride, he said a sentence, word for word, tone for tone, that I had whispered in the dark the previous evening. I froze, coffee sloshing from the mug. He kept smiling, eyes unreadable in the sunlight, like glassy stones hiding a current beneath. In that instant the forest felt cold again, as though dawn had been a trick of light, and something wearing human skin now stood between me and the trail home. The smile never faltered, but something in me cracked. I forced a laugh, pretending I hadn't noticed, while my pulse thudded like a drum beneath my skin. The man's voice had been exact, not just the words but the rhythm, the inflection, the way my breath had trembled when I'd spoken them. Only one explanation made sense, and it was the one my mind refused to accept. He hadn't heard me say that sentence. He had been there when I said it. I mumbled an excuse about breaking camp early and shoved my gear into my pack with shaking hands. When I glanced up, he was closer, though I hadn't heard a single footstep. His eyes were wrong. Not monstrous, not glowing, just wrong, like a photograph developed slightly out of focus. The more I stared, the less they seemed to belong to a living thing. As I started down the trail, he followed at a measured distance. Not speaking, not rushing, just matching my pace exactly, like a shadow with a heartbeat. I cut off the trail abruptly, crashing through brush toward the stream below. When I finally dared to look back, he stood perfectly still at the tree line, head tilted, watching. It should have comforted me. It didn't. Somehow the stillness was worse than pursuit. All day I felt him. Even when I couldn't see him, the forest seemed to bend around his presence. The way birdsong would fall silent, the sudden sharpness of pine-scented air, the eerie absence of wind. By late afternoon, my nerves were raw, every snapped twig sounding like a shot. I reached a small meadow and decided to camp early, though camping meant huddling beside a meager fire, my back to a rock wall, knife clutched tight in my hand. When darkness fell, the forest changed. The night seemed to thicken, congealing around the edges of my firelight. Then, from the blackness beyond the glow, I heard it, my own voice whispering. The exact pitch and tremor I'd heard when I'd spoken to myself in fear the previous night. It called softly, coaxing, my name repeated like a prayer. I spun in a circle, light swinging wildly, but there was no one there. Only trees. The whisper grew louder, overlapping itself, until it became a chorus of me. My stomach turned cold. I backed toward the trail, desperate to escape. That's when I saw movement. Figures emerging between the trees, one after another, each carrying my shape, my clothes, my face. They stepped into the firelight, smiling with mouths that stretched too wide, as if they had just learned how to smile by tearing skin at the edges. Panic overtook reason. I bolted into the darkness, branches clawing at my arms, my lungs burning. But no matter which way I turned, another version of me waited in the shadows, tilting its head with that same practiced mimicry. Their smiles never broke, their silence heavier than screams. Somewhere deep in the forest I stumbled and fell, and before the world went black, the last thing I saw was a circle of my own faces closing in, each one wearing my terror through the mist, like the ghost of a memory. Half-rotten planks stretching across a swamp that seemed older than the mountains surrounding it. The air smelled of stagnant water and decay, a wet heaviness that clung to my clothes and lungs. A pale moon hung low, its reflection fractured by the slow, oily ripples beneath the bridge. The locals had warned me not to come here after dark, but warnings only sharpened curiosity. They spoke of travelers who crossed and never returned, of something ancient that lurked below, waiting for footsteps to disturb its slumber. Up close, the bridge looked even worse. Its wooden beams were dark with age, and the handrails leaned like broken ribs. My boots groaned against the planks as I stepped forward, each creak echoing into the emptiness. Halfway across, I noticed something strange. Faint carvings etched into the beams, patterns that curled and twisted like tangled roots. My chest tightened. I'd seen these markings before, days earlier, scratched into the bark of trees deep in the forest. They were identical, too precise to be coincidence. Kneeling, I traced one of the symbols with my fingertip. The grooves felt unnaturally smooth, as though something had burned them into the wood rather than carved them. A chill passed through me, sharp and electric, and for a moment I swore I heard a faint whisper rising from beneath the planks. I stood quickly, my breath visible in the damp air despite the night's mild temperature. Leaning over the edge, I aimed my flashlight at the black water below. The beam barely penetrated the murk, revealing only shifting patterns of algae and a few broken branches caught between support beams. Then, between ripples, I saw my reflection staring back. But it wasn't quite mine. Its eyes were too wide, its mouth curled into a grin I wasn't wearing. I staggered back, heart pounding, the image dissolving into darkness as the water swallowed the light. Stories I'd overheard in town came rushing back. There was talk of a guardian spirit, or perhaps a predator, born from the swamp's depths. It was said to feed on fear, drawing strength from every terrified thought that crossed the bridge. Some even claimed it could take the shape of those who gazed into its waters, carrying a piece of them back into the darkness. At the time, I'd dismissed those tales as folklore. Standing there now, I wasn't so sure. The bridge moaned beneath me, the sound deeper and heavier than before. I froze, every muscle taut. The wind had died completely, yet the ropes and planks trembled as if something massive had just set its weight down beside me. Slowly, deliberately, the vibrations moved closer. My throat tightened as I realized I wasn't alone on the bridge, and whatever had joined me wasn't walking on two legs. Then came a sound that didn't belong to wood or rope, a slow, deliberate drip of water, as if something had just risen from the depths and was shaking itself dry. I turned toward the far side of the bridge, ready to run, but the mist thickened ahead like a closing door. The mist sealed shut behind me, swallowing every escape route like a curtain of breath. My throat tightened as the creaking underfoot deepened, resonating through the planks like a heartbeat magnified by wood and water. Whatever had joined me on the bridge wasn't visible, but it was there, pressing its weight into the structure. I could feel it in my knees, in my teeth, in the raw animal part of me screaming to run. I turned my flashlight downward again, though my trembling hand made the beam stutter. The black water shifted sluggishly, too thick to be natural. Then, with a terrible slowness, a shape surfaced beneath the reflection of the moon. It wasn't a body, but an outline, amorphous and sinuous like smoke trapped under ice. The water clung to it as though reluctant to let it go. My own reflection shimmered on the surface, only now its mouth moved without me, forming words I couldn't hear. Panic surged hot through my veins. I stumbled backward, breath coming in sharp, ragged pulls. The carvings along the beams seemed to glow faintly, their curling lines pulsing like veins under skin. I realized they weren't warnings at all. They were invitations. The bridge wasn't cursed by accident. It was a threshold, a mouth designed to feed, and I had stepped directly onto its tongue. From somewhere beneath the water came a sound, a wet exhale, followed by a slow, deliberate drip. It echoed impossibly loud in the night air, as if each drop marked a countdown. Then the whispering began, rising through the boards under my feet. It was a dozen voices speaking at once, low and wet, their words blurring into something that felt like drowning. My knees weakened. I understood in a bone-deep way that these were the last breaths of everyone who had vanished here. The weight on the bridge shifted closer, planks splintered, ropes strained. I didn't dare look behind me, terrified of what shape my fear might give it. My only thought was to run, but even as I turned toward the far bank, the mist thickened, twisting into hands that seemed to clutch at my chest. Each step felt like moving through molasses, my boots dragging, my lungs refusing to fill. Behind me, the creaking quickened, not like footsteps, but like something dragging itself, eager and endless. I burst through the fog and onto solid earth, collapsing on my hands and knees. The night air smelled clean, sharp with pine, but I couldn't shake the swamp's metallic tang from my tongue. The bridge loomed silent behind me, its shape already fading into the mist. Only the sound remained, that slow, mocking drip of water, each note a promise. Even now, safe in my own bed miles away, I hear it when I close my eyes. The steady creak of wood, the whispering voices tangled beneath the surface. And sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, I smell swamp water seeping through my dreams, and I know the thing beneath the Blackwater Bridge has not stopped rising. It is only waiting for me to return. The trail had long since thinned to little more than deer tracks when I first saw it. A cabin tucked between towering pines, its roof steep and sharp against the fading light. It shouldn't have been there. My map insisted this valley was uninhabited for miles, yet smoke curled from the chimney in a thin, steady line. The walls gleamed with fresh timber, shutters straight and painted a soft green, as if someone had built it only yesterday. The forest floor was thick with moss and needles, but around the cabin the ground was swept clean, deliberate, like a stage waiting for actors. I stood at the edge of the clearing, heart knocking in my ribs. Every instinct told me to turn back, but exhaustion spoke louder. I'd hiked since morning, my legs heavy with miles, and the thought of 4 walls and a roof felt like water in a desert. So I crossed the clearing, each step landing softer than it should have, as though the air itself had thickened. The door creaked when I pushed it open, the sound startling in the hush. Inside, the cabin glowed with warmth. A fire whispered in the hearth, casting long amber shadows across polished floorboards. A table stood in the corner, its surface bare but dustless, beside a single wooden chair. A bed waited against the far wall, quilt neatly folded, pillow plump as if fluffed by unseen hands. Everything smelled faintly of pine and wood smoke. I called out, my voice muffled by the thick logs. No answer, only the wind prowling the eaves. The strangeness pressed closer. No dishes, no tools, no clutter of living. Yet the room held a kind of order that suggested it wasn't abandoned at all. I ran my hand across the table. The wood was warm. Hunger eventually overcame unease. I ate from my pack near the fire, its heat seeping into my bones. The cabin creaked occasionally, the way old wood settles, but otherwise the night held its breath. Outside the window, the forest stood silent, the pines black against a sky washed pale by a rising moon. When fatigue finally claimed me, I lay on the narrow bed, quilt scratchy against my cheek. My last waking thought was how absurdly lucky I was to find this place. The fire cracked softly, lulling me under, the smell of smoke and resin thick in the room. But dreams came sharp-edged and restless. I saw movement outside the window, not the wind, but faces I couldn't quite name, pale and watching between the trees. I dreamed of footsteps circling the cabin, of whispers sliding beneath the doorframe. At one point, I thought I woke to the creak of the chair moving by itself, but the firelight blurred and pulled me back under before I could rise. Morning came thin and cold. My eyes opened to birdsong and damp air. The bed beneath me was gone. So was the cabin. I was lying on bare forest ground, pine needles in my hair, the sky a pale ceiling overhead. The world had shifted overnight, yet the forest seemed indifferent to my panic. My pack was gone, along with my boots, my flashlight, every trace of the night before erased. Only the whisper of wind through the pines remained, cool and detached, as though the cabin had been nothing more than a fever dream. I staggered to my feet, scanning the clearing. It wasn't even a clearing anymore. Where the cabin had stood, thick undergrowth stretched unbroken, sprouting ferns and young saplings that could only have taken years to grow. The ground was soft and damp, undisturbed, like no one had set foot here in decades. My mind clawed for rational explanations. Exhaustion, hallucination, a misread map. But then I saw it, a single object resting on the moss where my bed had been. It was a photograph. My heart pounded as I knelt to pick it up. The edges were frayed, the image slightly warped, but the scene was unmistakable. It showed me, lying on the bed in the cabin, mouth slightly open in sleep. The perspective was from outside the window, as if someone or something had been watching me from the dark. My hands trembled so violently that I nearly dropped it. Every instinct screamed to run, yet my legs felt rooted. The forest didn't just look different now. It felt different, heavier, as if the trees themselves leaned closer to listen. The air held a sharp metallic tang that burned the back of my throat. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped, deliberate, singular. I spun, clutching the photo like a shield, but saw only shifting shadows between the trunks. I forced myself to move, retracing the path I thought I'd taken the night before. The landscape betrayed me. Trails twisted into dead ends. Landmarks rearranged themselves like pieces on a board I didn't understand. Hours passed, but the sun never seemed to climb higher. Hunger gnawed at my gut, panic scraping raw beneath my skin. Then, just when my strength began to fail, I stumbled upon another anomaly, a circle of stones arranged with impossible precision. In the center lay another photograph face down. Against every rational impulse, I turned it over. It was me again. Only this time, I was standing exactly where I stood now, holding the first photograph in my hands. My breath caught. Behind my figure, in the photo's background, a shape loomed among the trees. Humanoid, impossibly tall, its face obscured by blur, like the camera itself had been too afraid to capture it clearly. The forest went utterly silent. Even the wind ceased. A cold realization seeped through me. The cabin hadn't vanished. It had moved, or perhaps I had crossed into a place where it never existed. Either way, something had marked me, claimed me. I dropped both photographs and ran, heart hammering. But as I sprinted between the trees, I swore I could hear it behind me. The slow, rhythmic creak of a chair rocking gently, somewhere just out of sight. The warning came in a whisper over coffee at the only diner in town. The waitress leaned close, her face pale under the flickering neon light. "If you hear whistling in the woods after dark," she said, "don't follow it. Don't even move. Just close your eyes and pray it passes you by." Her words seemed like the kind of old mountain superstition that locals used to scare outsiders. But there was something in her tone, a tremor she couldn't hide, that stuck with me long after I left. That night, the forest was a living thing. Wind slithered through the pines like breath through teeth, and the moon was a thin silver hook snagging clouds as they drifted past. My campfire had burned low, casting the world into fragments of orange light and shadow. I was just beginning to settle into my sleeping bag when I heard it, a whistle. It was soft, melodic, and almost tender, like a lullaby sung to a child. 3 slow notes rising, 1 falling. The sound floated through the trees, weaving between branches in a way that made it impossible to tell where it came from. My pulse quickened. I told myself it had to be another camper or maybe a stray echo from town. But even as I thought it, my gut tightened in warning. I sat frozen, every instinct telling me to stay by the dying fire. Yet curiosity is a dangerous thing. The whistle came again, this time a little closer, curling around my name like mist. My body moved before my mind could stop it. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped into the dark, the beam slicing through the fog in narrow, trembling arcs. The deeper I went, the stranger the forest became. Trails I knew by heart bent in unfamiliar ways. Trees leaning together to form archways that hadn't been there hours before. The whistle never stopped, repeating its eerie pattern. Sometimes it seemed far away, other times right beside me, as if the sound itself was alive and moving. My sense of direction began to unravel. Every landmark looked unfamiliar, every turn a mirror of the last. I tried to call out, to demand whoever it was reveal themselves, but my voice felt swallowed by the trees, my words falling flat. In their place, the whistling grew louder. There was a rhythm to it now, like a heartbeat synced to my own. Finally, through a break in the fog, I saw the source. A figure stood in the clearing, perfectly still. Its head tilted so far back it seemed to defy anatomy, throat exposed to the pale moonlight. Even from a distance I saw its mouth, or rather the absence of one. No lips, no teeth, just smooth skin where a mouth should have been. And yet, somehow, the whistle poured from it, clear and unbroken. A chill swept through me. I turned to flee, but before I could take a step, another whistle answered from somewhere behind me. Then another, and another, until the forest was alive with dozens of voices, all whistling the same terrible song. The sound multiplied until it felt like the whole forest was breathing through a flute. Every trunk and branch became a throat. The overlapping notes formed no melody I recognized, but they pulsed with a rhythm older than language, rising and falling like the tide. My flashlight beam jittered across tree bark scored with pale lines, the grooves resembling sheet music warped by water. I realized with a jolt that I'd seen these carvings near my camp earlier, but dismissed them as old axe marks. Now, under this sound, they looked like instructions. I backed up slowly, trying to retrace my path, but the ground itself betrayed me. Pine needles shifted under my boots as if stirred by unseen currents, erasing my footprints before I'd taken 3 steps. The fog swelled thicker, curling between my knees like smoke from an unseen fire. I turned in a slow circle. The original figure still stood in the clearing, its head tipped impossibly far, skin taut over an empty mouth. But others were stepping forward now, silhouettes peeling away from the trunks like shadows breaking off their owners. The whistling bent in pitch, higher now, trembling, and my skull buzzed with it. My own breath became ragged, matching the tempo. It felt less like I was hearing the sound and more like it was traveling inside me, vibrating through marrow. I pressed my palms over my ears, but the noise only grew sharper, seeping through my skin. Somewhere above, a bird shrieked once, then fell silent, as if the sound had cut it from the air. I forced my legs to move, stumbling backward until I hit a tree. Bark bit into my shoulder, grounding me for a heartbeat. In that brief pause, I heard something terrifying, my own whistle rising from between the other voices. Perfect pitch, perfect rhythm. It wasn't just echoing me, it was learning me. The fog parted and a shape emerged, my own outline, walking toward me through the trees. Its stride was a mirror of mine, its flashlight flickering in the same jittery arcs. Even its fear looked like mine except for the mouth, that smooth expanse of skin where a smile should be. It tilted its head, and the whistle that poured from it was my whistle, flawless and cold. Panic split my chest. I bolted into the dark, branches lashing my arms, the forest now a labyrinth of shifting archways and breathing mist. Every direction I turned, another version of me appeared, some tall, some small, all tilting their heads back, all whistling. Their voices braided into a single sound, rising like a tide around my ears. Ahead, through a lattice of black pines, a faint glow pulsed, my campfire, or something wearing its shape. I stumbled toward it, heart pounding, lungs tearing for air. Behind me, dozens of whistles rose in unison, a drawn-out note that felt like it could last forever. And over that endless sound, one thought beat in time with my feet. There would be no silence waiting at the fire, only the moment the forest finally opened its mouth. From another lifetime, its creases frayed and darkened with age. Rivers spidered across its surface like veins, mountains were sketched with sharp black lines, but near the center, the ink stopped abruptly. Beyond a jagged ridgeline lay nothing, just a pale, empty space where the cartographer's pen had refused to go. Locals called it the Nowhere. For weeks I'd heard the whispers. Campfire tales of cabins that appeared and vanished, hikers who walked into the mist and never came back, bridges where something moved beneath the water. Each story was a thread, and somewhere in this blank patch of wilderness, those threads knotted together. I had to see it for myself. The first miles were familiar, almost welcoming. Sunlight streamed through gaps in the canopy, and the air smelled of damp leaves and soil. Birds sang in high, clear notes that reminded me of childhood hikes. But as I drew closer to the edge of the map, the forest began to change. The trees grew denser, their trunks crowding together like conspirators whispering secrets. Even the light dimmed, taking on a muted green hue as though I were walking underwater. When my compass needle began to spin, I told myself it was just magnetized rock. But then my watch faltered, its second hand stuttering backward before leaping forward again. My breath quickened. Somewhere behind me, branches cracked, not the sharp snap of falling limbs, but the deliberate rhythm of footsteps. I turned, but the path I'd followed had vanished. swallowed by the forest. Panic tried to take root, but I forced myself onward. Each bend in the trail felt subtly wrong, like walking through a memory that had been misfiled. At one point, I swore I saw my own boot prints ahead of me, circling back in impossible loops. My throat tightened as I passed the same moss-covered log for the third time, even though I hadn't turned. The forest wasn't just confusing me, it was rearranging itself as though I were a piece on a living board. Hours blurred. The sun hovered at the same angle no matter how far I walked, caught in some endless twilight. My skin prickled with the sensation of being observed. Once I caught a glimpse of a figure between the trees, standing perfectly still. When I blinked, it was gone, leaving only the hollow sound of wind. Then the ground sloped sharply downward, and I stumbled into a clearing unlike any I'd seen before. At its center rose a massive stone monolith, black and glistening as if wet, though no rain had fallen. Ancient markings spiraled across its surface, the same symbols I'd seen carved into trees, etched into bridges, scrawled in the margins of missing persons reports. The sight stole the air from my lungs. I approached slowly, each step heavy with dread. The closer I got, the more the air seemed to vibrate, a low hum thrumming in my bones. My fingertips hovered over the stone's surface. Somewhere deep in the forest, a whisper stirred, dozens of voices merging into one. And as I finally touched the monolith, the world collapsed into darkness. Darkness didn't feel empty. It felt crowded, like standing in a hallway between walls of breath. My hand stayed on the monolith and the stone felt back, cool, grainy, attentive. A tremor climbed my arm to the hinge of my jaw, tuning every tooth like a struck glass. When sound returned, it wasn't wind or birds. It was pages turning by the thousands. The forest was reading itself aloud. A faint radiance bled from the carvings, lines plating and looping until the face of the stone looked like a map coded for another species. Images rose behind my eyes, a cabin's window blinking like a lid, lanterns pulsing red as arteries, a bridge inhaling, a cave mouth rehearsing names. Each scene layered the next until they weren't stories but instructions. But what I didn't expect was the certainty that followed. None of these places were separate. They were organs in the same body, time refluxed. Heavy footsteps circled, the same measured gait that had learned my voice, only now the steps belonged to nothing I could see. I tasted iron, then pine sap, then wet limestone, as though the forest were teaching me an alphabet of flavors. Symbols lifted from the rock and hovered like ash. The crescent pendant, the lattice of beams, the spiral I had traced on bark. Patterns repeated like a genetic refrain. If the forest had DNA, this was it. Faces gathered within the glow. Ethan on the ridge, eyes raw with confusion. The child with the crimson lantern, stepping toward a mouth the town pretended not to see. The hollow-eyed sentinel, not hunting but measuring. Their lips moved in silence before a single sentence landed in my head with the force of weather. Stay where the map ends, and the map will learn you. The phrase clicked into place like a bone set under pressure. My hand wanted to recoil. It didn't. The hum deepened until thought shook loose. Distance thinned, and the clearing flexed like a diaphragm. Mist feathered up around my calves, cool and electric, and through it I saw my own outlines. Me beside a dying fire, me pausing at a cave, me leaning over black water. Each double wore my posture, but not my intention. Their smiles were small and wrong, seams stitched too tight. I asked without sound what the forest wanted. It answered by arranging. Branches knitted a vault. Roots braided a cradle. The glow paced itself to my pulse. The world felt engineered, like a lung timing its breaths to mine. Then the carvings pulsed once, and in that single beat the rule revealed itself. The forest kept what mapped itself upon it. Every fear, every step, every name was a cut, and cuts become doors. Light collapsed to a filament between my palm and the stone, bright as a nerve. I understood with brutal clarity. If I tore free, the filament would snap back and seal, and everything I had awakened would hunt for the outline it had borrowed from me. If I stayed, I would finish the drawing and vanish into its ink. Heat gathered along the thread like sunrise trapped in wire. I lifted my other hand, breath pitching, and asked the oldest question. Which door keeps me whole? And which one erases me for good? Subscribe, if you dare.